February 1975, Mickey's boxing gym on the south side of Chicago. The temperature outside was hovering near freezing, but inside the gym the air was thick with heat, sweat, and the kind of intensity that only comes from serious fighters perfecting their craft. Muhammad Ali pushed through the heavy glass door, carrying his worn leather gym bag, looking like any other fighter coming in for an evening training session. What happened in the next hour would become one of the most talked about demonstrations of skill over size in combat sports history. It would teach a 280-pound professional wrestler the hardest lesson of his life, and prove that true fighting mastery has nothing to do with age or weight, and everything to do with understanding the science of movement, timing, and the human body. This is the incredible true story of how Muhammad Ali turned a wrestler's insults into a teaching moment that would transform not just one man's understanding of fighting, but an entire gym's approach to martial arts. If you're fascinated by stories where wisdom defeats arrogance and skill conquers size, subscribe for more incredible encounters that prove the greatest victories often happen outside the ring. Muhammad Ali was 33 years old in February 1975. Just 3 months removed from one of the greatest upsets in boxing history, his stunning victory over George Foreman in Zaire. The rumble in the jungle had proven that reports of Ali's decline had been greatly exaggerated, but the questions about his age persisted. In a sport where most fighters peak in their 20s, Ali was considered by many to be fighting on borrowed time. Mickey's boxing gym was the kind of place where those questions didn't matter. Located on Chicago's south side, it was a working-class facility where serious fighters came to perfect their craft without the distractions of fame or media attention. Faded fight posters lined the walls, 3 heavy bags hung from creaking chains, and an elevated boxing ring sat in the center with worn ropes and patched canvas. The gym radiated authenticity. This wasn't a fitness center or a place where celebrities came to be seen. This was where fighters, real fighters, came to do the unglamorous work that separated contenders from pretenders. The constant percussion of gloves against heavy bags, the steady rhythm of jump ropes hitting concrete, and the occasional grunt of exertion created a symphony of serious training. Ali was there that Thursday evening because he understood something that many champions forget: skills require constant maintenance. Success hadn't made him soft or arrogant. He was scheduled to meet with a young amateur heavyweight named Tommy who had been asking for advice. A kid who showed promise but lacked proper fundamentals. As Ali entered the gym, he was dressed simply in gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed, "I'm Muhammad Ali, the most famous athlete on earth." He was just another fighter preparing to work. The gym was moderately busy for a Thursday evening, with maybe a dozen fighters working various stations. Some were hitting bags, others jumping rope, a few sparring lightly in the ring. The usual sounds of serious training filled the air. Leather smacking leather, the steady rhythm of jump ropes, the occasional grunt of exertion, quiet conversations between trainers and fighters. Most of the men in the gym recognized Ali, of course. It was hard not to recognize the most famous face in boxing. But this was a place where celebrities were respected but not fawned over. Everyone there understood the work required to step into a ring. They nodded respectfully when Ali made eye contact, offered quiet, "How you doing, champ?" greetings, then returned to their training. This was the kind of respect Ali appreciated most. Recognition based on craft and courage rather than fame. Ali moved to an empty corner, set down his bag, and began his warm-up routine. Simple movements, arm circles, hip rotations, light shadowboxing to get his blood flowing. After 10 minutes of warming up, he began hitting a heavy bag. Not the explosive, show-stopping combinations he was famous for, but steady, measured work. Left jab, right cross, step to the side, reset, repeat. Each punch landed with the sharp crack of proper technique, not the dull thud of amateur punching, but the precise sound of a master craftsman at work. His footwork was fluid and economical. The famous Ali shuffle made occasional appearances, but mostly he was just moving correctly, weight on the balls of his feet, creating angles, never standing still long enough to become a target. Even in simple training, his defensive instincts were automatic. His head moved subtly with each combination, never quite where an opponent would expect it to be. A few fighters stopped their own training to watch, not because they were starstruck, but because they were students of the sport, watching a master demonstrate fundamentals. They saw details in Ali's technique that amateur observers would miss: the precise timing of his hip rotation, the way his jab snapped back to his chin, the constant small adjustments in distance and angle that kept him in position to attack or defend. That's when Frank Kowalski walked over. Frank was a mountain of a man, 6'4", tall, 280 pounds of muscle, built over 15 years as a professional wrestler. At 38 years old, he had thick forearms covered in dark hair, a chest like a barrel, and hands the size of dinner plates. His neck was so thick it seemed to merge directly with his shoulders. Everything about Frank's physical presence suggested overwhelming power. The kind of strength that comes from years of grappling with men who are trying to genuinely hurt you. Frank had been a legitimate heavyweight wrestling contender for 8 years, competing in matches that lasted 40 minutes or more. His career had ended 2 years earlier with a knee injury, and now he trained young wrestlers and worked as a sparring partner for heavyweight boxers. Frank had been watching Ali hit the bag for the past 5 minutes, and he wasn't impressed. Not because Ali's technique was poor. Even Frank could see that Ali moved with the precision of a master. But Frank's worldview was shaped by his wrestling background, where size, strength, and the ability to control another man's body were the ultimate measures of fighting ability. From Frank's perspective, boxing was limited. Boxers learned to punch and move, but they never learned to grapple. They never learned what it felt like when someone used pure strength to dominate them, never experienced the panic that comes when a stronger opponent gets you in an inescapable hold. Frank walked over to where Ali was training, stopped about 6 feet away, crossed his massive arms over his chest, and watched with the expression of someone studying an interesting, but ultimately flawed approach to combat. Ali sensed the presence, felt someone watching him intensely, but he didn't stop his training. He finished his combination, let the bag settle, wiped sweat from his forehead with the bottom of his T-shirt, then turned to face Frank. "Afternoon," Ali said politely. His tone was neutral, friendly without being eager. He had dealt with countless strangers approaching him over the years and had learned to remain open but cautious until he could gauge their intentions. Frank nodded slowly. "Muhammad Ali," he said, not as a greeting but as an identification, like he was confirming something he already knew. His voice was deep and gravelly, the voice of a man who had spent years shouting over the noise of wrestling crowds. "That's right," Ali responded. "Don't believe we've met." "Frank Kowalski," Frank said, extending one of his massive hands. Ali shook it, noting the incredible grip strength and the calluses that spoke of years of hard physical work. "I was a professional wrestler for 15 years. Now I train fighters here. Wrestling's a tough sport," Ali acknowledged genuinely. "Takes real strength and conditioning to compete at the professional level." Frank smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who thought they knew something the other person didn't. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about, actually. Strength." Ali waited, sensing that Frank had something more to say, something that had been building in his mind while he watched. "See, I've been watching you hit that bag," Frank continued, his voice growing more confident. "You got nice technique, real nice. Quick hands, good footwork, all that boxing stuff. But here's the thing," Frank paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You're getting old, Muhammad, 33 years old. That's ancient in fighting years." Ali's expression didn't change, but he was now fully focused on Frank, reading the man's body language, tone, and intention. "And I'm watching you move," Frank continued, "and I can see it. You're slowing down, not as fast as you used to be. Still quick, but not like when you were 25. Age catches up to everybody, even champions." The gym had gotten quieter around them. Other fighters had stopped their training, sensing tension building in the conversation. They had seen this before, strangers who approached famous fighters with challenges disguised as conversations. Frank took a step closer to Ali, using his size advantage to create intimidation. "Thing is, speed don't mean much when you're fighting someone who can just grab you and use real strength. Someone my size." Frank's voice carried absolute confidence. "I outweigh you by what, 80, 90 pounds. That's not just a little size difference. That's overwhelming physical advantage." Ali remained calm, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Size is definitely an advantage in fighting," he agreed, "no question about that." Frank seemed surprised by Ali's easy agreement. He had been expecting defensiveness, argument, the kind of reaction that would justify escalating the confrontation. Instead, Ali's calm acknowledgement threw him off balance temporarily. Right, Frank said, regaining his momentum. So here's what I'm thinking. All this boxing stuff, the dancing, the hand speed, the fancy footwork, that works great against other boxers. But against a real wrestler, someone who knows how to close distance and use strength, your advantages disappear real quick. Frank's voice was getting louder now, his confidence growing with each word. I could just rush you, grab you, take you down, control you with pure strength. All your speed and technique wouldn't matter once I got my hands on you. You'd be helpless. The gym was now completely silent, except for Frank's voice echoing off the walls. Every fighter had stopped training to watch this confrontation unfold. They had seen variations of this scene many times. Local tough guys challenging visiting fighters, usually drunk fans looking to make names for themselves. But this felt different. Frank wasn't drunk or clearly unstable. He was making what he believed was a legitimate point about fighting styles and physical advantages. Ali looked at Frank thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering his argument. You think so? Ali asked quietly. I know so. Frank responded emphatically. Look, nothing personal, Mohammed. I respect what you've accomplished in boxing, but boxing isn't real fighting. Real fighting is when someone can use their whole body, use wrestling, use strength. Boxing is limited, artificial, too many rules. Frank seemed to be warming to his theme now, enjoying having an audience for ideas he had clearly thought about extensively. In wrestling, we learn to control a man's entire body. We learn leverage, how to use our strength efficiently, how to negate someone else's advantages. A good wrestler doesn't need to be fast because he controls distance and positioning. He doesn't need fancy technique because he uses fundamental strength and body control. Ali nodded slowly, absorbing Frank's words. That's an interesting perspective, he said. Wrestling definitely teaches valuable skills. Again, Frank seemed thrown off by Ali's reasonable response. He had been prepared for argument, not thoughtful consideration. The thing is, Frank continued, his voice now carrying a tone of absolute certainty, guys like you get used to fighting within boxing rules. You expect your opponent to stand at distance and trade punches. You expect space to move around. But what happens when someone doesn't give you that space? What happens when someone just overwhelms you with size and strength? Frank took another step closer, now standing within arm's reach of Ali. At this distance, the size difference was stark. Frank towered over Ali, outweighed him by nearly 90 pounds, and radiated physical power from every inch of his massive frame. You're too old and slow to handle someone like me now, Frank said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silent gym. Your best years are behind you. Time's caught up. You might still be champion, but against a real fighter, someone who doesn't play by boxing rules, you'd get dominated. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a line drawn in the sand. Every person in the gym understood that Frank had just crossed from analysis into insult, from observation into provocation. Ali looked up at Frank's face, studied him for a long moment, then asked quietly, "Would you like me to show you something?" Frank grinned widely, sensing victory. "Sure," he said. "Show me how boxing beats wrestling." "I won't be using boxing," Ali said simply. "Just want to demonstrate something about speed versus strength. Something about timing." Frank's grin widened further. "Okay, demonstrate away. Try to grab me," Ali said. Frank laughed. "Try to grab you? Yes. Use your strength advantage. Use your wrestling skills. Just try to get your hands on me." Frank looked around the gym at all the watching faces, then back at Ali. "You sure about this?" "Completely sure." Frank squared up, dropped into a wrestler's crouch, hands extended in front of him. He wasn't worried about hurting Ali. He just wanted to prove his point about size and strength. In his mind, this would be simple: close distance quickly, grab Ali, demonstrate control, make his point, end the discussion. "Ready?" Frank asked. Ali nodded, standing upright, hands relaxed at his sides. No defensive posture whatsoever. Frank committed, rushing forward with surprising speed for a man his size, arms reaching out to grab Ali around the waist, planning to lift him off his feet and demonstrate the helplessness that comes from being physically overpowered. What happened next took exactly 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds contained a masterclass in distance, timing, and the difference between raw power and refined skill. As Frank rushed forward, Ali didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped slightly to his right, just enough to make Frank's grabbing motion miss by inches. Frank's momentum carried him past where Ali had been standing, and suddenly he was grasping at empty air. Before Frank could stop and reset, Ali moved again. Not away from Frank, but alongside him, matching Frank's momentum briefly before changing direction. Frank tried to adjust, reaching with his left arm to catch Ali, but Ali was already moving to a different position. Frank stumbled, his forward momentum now working against him as he tried to change direction while off balance. He managed to stay on his feet, but had to take 2 stuttering steps to regain stability. By the time Frank turned around to face Ali again, Ali was standing exactly where he had started, hands still relaxed at his sides, breathing normally, completely composed. Frank was breathing harder now, slightly flustered by his failure to even make contact. "Okay," he said, trying to regain his confidence. "I wasn't ready for that. Let me try again." "Go ahead," Ali said calmly. Frank approached more carefully this time, trying to use his wrestling training to cut off escape angles to corner Ali and force contact. He moved in a semicircle, arms extended, planning to drive Ali toward the wall where his mobility would be limited. Ali watched Frank approach, read his body language, saw the plan developing. As Frank committed to his grabbing motion again, Ali didn't move dramatically. He took 1 small step backward and slightly to the left, just enough to make Frank reach farther than he intended. As Frank extended himself trying to make contact, Ali placed his right hand gently on Frank's left shoulder and simply guided him past, using Frank's own momentum to send him stumbling toward the heavy bag Ali had been hitting earlier. Frank had to grab the bag to keep from falling, his face now red with embarrassment and exertion. The entire sequence, from Frank's second charge to his stumbling grab for the heavy bag, took exactly 4 seconds. "One more time?" Ali asked politely. Frank was now genuinely frustrated. In his wrestling career, he had prided himself on his ability to control distance and dictate the terms of physical engagement. But Ali was making him look clumsy, amateurish, ineffective. Frank rushed a 3rd time, abandoning technique for pure aggressive forward movement, determined to at least make contact with the smaller man who had been embarrassing him in front of a gym full of witnesses. This time, Ali's movement was even more economical. As Frank charged, Ali simply stepped to the side while simultaneously extending his left foot slightly. Frank, moving at full speed, tripped over Ali's foot and went down hard, landing on his hands and knees on the canvas-covered floor. The fall was hard enough to knock the wind out of Frank temporarily. He stayed down for a moment, breathing heavily, more from shock than physical damage. Total elapsed time from Frank's 3rd charge to his position crawling on hands and knees 6 seconds. The gym remained completely silent as Frank slowly got back to his feet, dusting off his hands, his face now showing confusion alongside embarrassment. Ali approached him, offered his hand to help Frank steady himself. "You okay?" Ali asked with genuine concern. Frank nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. 3 times he had tried to use his size and strength advantage. 3 times he had failed to even make meaningful contact with a man who weighed 90 pounds less than him. 3 times he had ended up off balance, out of position, looking foolish. "How?" Frank asked simply. Ali's answer would be quoted in boxing magazines for years afterward. "Frank, you're absolutely right about strength being important in fighting. You're also right about size being an advantage. But fighting isn't about having advantages. It's about using them at the right time, in the right way." Ali gestured toward the ring in the center of the gym. "You tried to use your strength when I was prepared for it, when I could see it coming, when I had space to move. Strength without timing is just wasted energy." Frank listened intently, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. "The thing about speed," Ali continued, "isn't that it beats strength. Speed creates opportunities to use strength more effectively. I wasn't trying to overpower you just now. I was using your own strength against you, redirecting it, letting your momentum work for me instead of against me." Ali walked over to one of the heavy bags, motioned for Frank to follow. "Watch this," he said, then threw a simple jab at the bag. The bag barely moved. "No power there, right?" Ali asked. Frank nodded. "Now watch this." Ali threw the same jab, but this time he timed it to land just as Frank pushed the bag toward him. The combination of Ali's punch and the bag's momentum created a much more dramatic impact. "Same punch?" Ali explained, "but timing changed everything. I didn't punch harder. I punched smarter." Frank was beginning to understand. "So when I was rushing at you, I was giving you momentum to work with." "Exactly," Ali finished. Your strength became my strength once I learned how to redirect it instead of opposing it directly. Ali looked directly at Frank. You weren't wrong about size and strength being advantages, but you assumed that having those advantages meant knowing how to use them. That's two different things. Frank nodded slowly, his worldview shifting as he processed this lesson. Here's what I saw when I watched you move. Ali continued. You've got incredible raw power, and you know wrestling technique. But you've always been the biggest, strongest guy in the room. You've never had to learn how to fight someone bigger than you, so you never learned how to use technique to overcome size disadvantages. Ali paused to let this sink in. That's why what I did surprised you. I've been the smaller fighter in plenty of confrontations. I've had to learn how to make speed and timing overcome strength and size. You've never needed to learn that lesson. Frank considered this. In his wrestling career, he had indeed almost always been one of the larger, stronger competitors. His technique was solid, but it was built on a foundation of physical dominance. He had never had to develop the subtle skills required to overcome a significant size disadvantage. Would you be willing to teach me? Frank asked, the question surprising both men with its sincerity. Ali smiled for the first time since their conversation began. You want to learn from someone who's too old and slow. Frank's face reddened with embarrassment. I apologize for saying that. I was wrong. No need to apologize, Ali said genuinely. You were testing your understanding against mine. That's how we learn, by challenging our assumptions and seeing what happens. Ali looked around the gym, noting that every fighter was still watching their conversation. Tell you what, I come here twice a week to work with young fighters. If you're serious about learning, join us. I'll show you how boxing principles can complement wrestling technique. Frank nodded eagerly. I'd like that. Good. But understand what I'll be teaching isn't about making you a better boxer. It's about making you a better fighter, more complete, someone who can use strength when it's the right tool, but who has other options when strength isn't enough. Over the following months, Frank became a regular fixture at Ali's training sessions. The relationship that developed between them surprised everyone who had witnessed their initial confrontation. Ali didn't try to turn Frank into a boxer. Instead, he taught him principles that enhanced his existing wrestling skills. Frank learned footwork that allowed him to close distance more effectively. He discovered timing that let him grab opponents when they were off balance. He developed positioning skills that maximized his strength advantage instead of just relying on it. Frank, for his part, taught Ali about leverage and body control, showing him how wrestlers think about controlling an opponent's center of gravity, how to use his own body weight more effectively in clinch situations. Their training sessions became legendary among Chicago's fighting community, the 280-pound wrestler learning boxing principles from the heavyweight champion, the aging boxer learning wrestling concepts from a man who had once competed at the highest levels of professional wrestling. But more importantly, Frank's entire understanding of fighting evolved. He stopped seeing wrestling and boxing as competing martial arts and started seeing them as complementary systems. He learned that the best fighters aren't specialists who perfect one approach. They're students who constantly learn new ways to solve the fundamental problem of physical conflict. Frank's transformation had ripple effects throughout Chicago's combat sports community. Young wrestlers started attending boxing classes to improve their footwork and timing. Amateur boxers began incorporating basic wrestling concepts to improve their clinch work and takedown defense. Within 2 years, Frank opened his own small gym where he taught what he called hybrid fighting, a blend of wrestling and boxing principles that produced more complete, adaptable fighters. Ali continued to visit Frank's gym occasionally, both men now understanding that their initial confrontation had been less about proving who was right and more about discovering what they could learn from each other. Years later, when sports journalists asked Frank about his most important learning experience, he always told the story of February 1975 at Mickey's boxing gym. Not just the 10 seconds when Ali demonstrated the difference between strength and skill, but the months that followed when Ali proved that true champions aren't just great fighters, they're great teachers. Ali taught me that being proven wrong is the first step to getting better, Frank would say. Most people's ego won't let them learn from someone they've challenged. Ali didn't let my pride prevent my education. Frank trained for another 20 years, eventually becoming one of Chicago's most innovative fighting instructors. When young athletes would dismiss techniques from different martial arts traditions, Frank would tell them about February 1975, when his assumptions were dismantled in 10 seconds by a boxer who proved that wisdom matters more than weight. The incident at Mickey's gym became part of Chicago's fighting folklore, passed down from trainer to student, a reminder that the moment when you realize you might be wrong is the moment when real learning begins. The man who called Ali too old and slow learned that age brings something more valuable than youth: the wisdom to use technique over force, timing over power, and intelligence over intimidation. In 10 seconds, Frank Kowalski went from arrogant challenger to humble student, and in the months that followed, he discovered that the greatest victories come not from dominating others, but from mastering yourself. Ali's lesson that day wasn't just about fighting. It was about life. Sometimes the person you're trying to challenge is the one who can teach you what you most need to learn. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from your muscles, but from your willingness to admit you might be wrong and learn something new. Frank Kowalski entered that gym thinking he would prove Muhammad Ali was past his prime. He left knowing he had met a master who was just hitting his stride as a teacher. The 10 seconds that put him crawling on the floor became the foundation for decades of growth, innovation, and success. Because sometimes the hardest falls lead to the highest rises, and sometimes the most humbling moments become the most transformative. Muhammad Ali understood that, and on a cold February evening in Chicago, he shared that wisdom with a man who was ready to receive it, even if he didn't know it yet.